I'm Dominic Nichols, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today we bring you the latest news from the front lines, including President Zelensky's decision to sack a senior general and why the EU is still buying Russian gas.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 20th of November, 1 year and 269 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today I'm joined by Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes and James Kilner, our Central Asia expert, who's worked on the Moscow desk since February 2022. So firstly, let's go over the weekend. Russia intercepted two Ukrainian drones, or two drones alleged to have been either come from or operating on behalf of Ukraine, just to be totally correct there. Intercepted them over Moscow Oblast yesterday. This comes from Moscow's mayor. So Sergei Sobyanin said the two drones, were downed over the Bogorodskoye area. That's about 8 km northeast of the Kremlin. And also the city of Elektrostol, which is about 40 km due east of the capital. No reports of damage or casualties. Now, Kyiv have said nothing, as usual. They don't comment about any of these kind of incidents. But it does raise questions again about where these drones were launched from and who was behind the attacks. If they were long-range drones, that's one thing. I mean, Moscow is 400 km away from the nearest point of the Ukrainian border. So that speaks of very poor air defence if something's able to get that far. If they were short-range drones, I mean, ditto the point about poor air defence around Moscow, but also that suggests that somebody inside Russia is able to do this now. Could be Ukrainian special forces, Russian partisans, albeit we've seen more of their activity down in the border areas to the south. Could be a false flag attack. I mean, I note that there was no damage and no casualties, as per Mr. Sobyanin, the Moscow mayor. So could be a false flag attack by Russia just to blame it on Kyiv and then keep the compliant nation constantly in fear of attacks. So who knows? But we will continue to report as we see it. Next, President Zelensky has said deliveries of key artillery shells to Ukraine from Western allies and partners have really slowed down, his words, really slowed down, since the outbreak of the Israel-Hamas war. So Mr. Zelensky said he would defend what is ours after the decline in supply of 155mm shells, which are also used by the IDF, Israel Defense Forces. Now, despite assurances from President Joe Biden that American support for Israel would not impact aid for Ukraine, deliveries of supplies earmarked for Mr. Zelensky's forces have reportedly been redirected to Tel Aviv in recent weeks. Now, I question the comment there about redirected because I think a lot of the supply of the additional 155 shells that the US have been pledging for Ukraine have come from their previously earmarked stocks for Israel. So I don't know if it's a question of redirecting them or if they're now being sent where they were always intended to, and that's had a knock-on effect. But the upshot is that Kyiv is getting not as much as it had been in recent months. A long-running conversation, which we've had many times, about the capacity of Ukraine and the US and Western partners to ramp up artillery production. Now, Mr. Biden's administration is operating on a constrained budget for assistance for both countries because of opposition from Republicans in the House of Representatives. They've declined to put his $105 billion aid package to a vote last week. President Zelensky said, it's not like the US said, we don't give Ukraine any. No, this is him continuing. It's just that everyone is fighting for stockpiles themselves. This is life. I'm not saying that this is positive, but it's life and we have to defend what's ours. So taking a fairly pragmatic view there, pragmatic / doesn't want to upset the US, which is a fair political position to hold. Now, an US administration official said the aid to Ukraine would effectively be rationed in the coming months to ensure that it can last until a funding agreement is reached with Congress, which we think, Western officials told me last week, that they are confident it will happen this year. I think they meant this calendar year, not financial year. The White House had intended to pass a single budget resolution on Ukraine to last through to after next year's US presidential election in November in what they're calling a one-and-done plan. Mr. Biden's supplemental request contained nearly $50 billion in Ukraine funding, plus just over $14 billion for Israel. Kyiv's other allies in the West are also struggling to maintain supply levels. Germany has said that the European Union will not hit the one-year target of sending 1 million artillery shells to Ukraine by March. You may remember Josep Borrell, EU's top diplomat. He was speaking a couple of weeks ago. He said the war in Israel would make it more difficult for the bloc to provide support to Ukraine. Speaking at the time, he said, "Let's be frank, the crisis in the Middle East is already having a lasting impact on our policy in Ukraine." So the political machinations out in the open again for everyone to see. Next, Russia's draconian laws are silencing soldiers' families and crushing dissent. This is according to Britain's Ministry of Defence. They said that this morning. In their latest intelligence briefing, Britain's MOD said extending deployments on the front line has sowed dissent amongst the soldiers, Russian soldiers and families. UK Defence Intelligence message out on Twitter this morning said on the 7th of November 2023, wives of deployed Russian soldiers conducted what was probably the first public street protest in Moscow since the invasion of Ukraine. Now, these protesters gathered in the central Teatralina Square, that's a couple of hundred metres due north of Red Square. They unfurled banners demanding the rotation of their loved ones away from the front line. Since the start of the full-scale invasion last year, been regular posting on social media that's provided daily examples of Russian wives and mothers making online appeals protesting against the conditions of their families' service. However, British MOD is saying Russia's draconian legislation has so far prevented troops' relatives from coalescing into an influential lobbying force, as soldiers' mothers did during the Afghan-Soviet wars of the 80s, or war of the 1980s. Police broke up the Teatralina Square protest within minutes, but the protesters' demand is notable. MOD here finishing off their message saying the apparently indefinitely extended combat deployments of personnel without rotation is increasingly seen as unsustainable, both by the troops themselves and by their relatives. So, start something? Potentially. Now, Joe Barnes, Brussels correspondent. I said on last week's Defence In-Depth video, available on all good YouTube channels, that a proper examination of what went wrong as well as what went right in Ukraine's counter-offensive could lead to reorganisation, maybe even the sacking of senior generals. However, I wasn't expecting anything to happen so soon. So, Joe, what news from the diplomatic and political front?
Yeah, so let's start with the story which we learned about yesterday, sort of afternoon. So Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, has sacked a leading commander in Ukraine's military. He has sacked Major General Tatiana, and I apologise for my pronunciation, but Ostashchenko, who was the commander of Ukraine's essentially military medical forces, so looking after combat medics. And it comes at a really interesting time, because as Dom was mentioning, we're learning the lessons from the counteroffensive, what went wrong, what went right. And one of those lessons and complaints that I've actually heard before the counteroffensive was properly launched was the quality of medical supplies and training available to combat medics. And Dom will probably be able to give you a better sort of overshot on that, so I might bring him back in. But when you are on the offensive, I think it is, you are about 3-1 more likely to sustain casualties than when you're on the defensive. So essentially, Ukraine was in need of combat medics, and I remember writing about this just before the counteroffensive really kicked off, and that is one of the problems. So Zelensky yesterday, he said, look, there is little time left to wait for results. Quick action is needed for forthcoming changes. This has been repeatedly discussed in society, in particular in the community of our combat medics. A fundamentally new level of medical support for our military is needed. So as I sort of mentioned, the shake-up comes in the discussion about why the slow progress in the south and east of this sort of months-long counteroffensive. But it also comes at a time, which is really interesting, a bit where there appears to be this sort of escalating mountain row over the counteroffensive and the state of the war between the politicians and the armed forces. If you remember back, we've spoken about it before, that Ukraine's commander-in-chief, General Valery Zaluzhny, said earlier this month that his forces had reached a stalemate with their Russian enemy, and said that Kyiv would basically need more sophisticated technology to break the deadlock. For these comments, which were made to The Economist, he was publicly derided by President Zelensky, who denied the war was heading into a stalemate and said that the suggestion of his military commander only eases the work of the aggressor and generates panic amongst Kyiv's Western backers. So over the weekend, the Ukrainian president held talks with his who's probably not newly appointed defense minister anymore, Rustem Umerov, to discuss their military priorities heading into what they saw as the next phase of the conflict. So the sacking of the military commander here is part of that. But they also agreed that this would, on the medical front, would require like sort of better quality tourniquets. They're those devices, essentially like a strap, almost like a belt that you can put over a wound or a wounded limb, which is seeping excess blood, and tighten it off to basically stop the flow of blood. And they are sort of a really simple device, but are considered game changers and real lifesavers when used correctly. They also mentioned the need for better training and more communication in line with NATO standards. So Zelensky went on to say there will not be much time to wait for results. Changes need to be made quickly. Mr. Umerov wrote on the Telegram messaging app, the shake-up required a digitalization of tactical medicine and better rotation of servicemen. There is simply no place for such problems as subpar tourniquets. And I think I should bring in Dom you've obviously gone through lots of training. I've done basic sort of combat medicine as part of the hostile environment courses that we all have to do. But what we should say is these tourniquets, while being lifesavers, they can be not deadly per se, but they can lead to massive problems if not used correctly. And I remember speaking to a number of combat medics and people treating wounded soldiers downstream in Ukraine, and they said that because of some of the poor training some combat medics and soldiers have received, tourniquets were often applied unnecessarily, and that basically can lead to amputations, because you basically get about 15 minutes, if you were to say strap off your leg, before it suddenly basically kills what's underneath it because there's no blood supply. And I'll turn to Dom, so I know you've got a few thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially it. So a tourniquet is just a modern, well, it's been around for ages. It's just a strap that stops blood flow, essentially. So if you have primarily a limb injury, legs, arms, then it's very quick. You can very quickly bleed out. So you lose a lot. You might survive the incident that caused you to have the catastrophic injury, but by then bleeding out, you just die through loss of blood. So you've got to keep the blood inside the body. So tourniquet then round the femoral artery, or the top of the leg, to cut the femoral artery off, so it stops chucking blood everywhere, or around your arm, is designed to do exactly that. Now, there's a few problems with it. If you don't do it properly, if you don't put it on properly, then obviously the blood can continue to flow and leave the body. If you put it on and leave it on for too long, as you say, Joe, obviously the body needs blood. So if you leave it on for too long, the limb will die. So if you leave it on for too long, you could do more damage. But equally, when you take it off, you have to do it really gently, because that sudden flow again of blood can sort of burst through. It's not just a question of tightening something up and leaving it at that. It's you do need to train with these things. And I remember in Afghanistan, a lot of our drivers were opening the package, and of course they should be sort of hermetically sealed, so they're clean. But they were opening the package and putting the tourniquets on really loosely around their thighs, so that if they hit a roadside bomb and lost a leg or needed to apply it, all they had to do was quickly yank on the side that was exposed and then sort of hold it down with the strap, rather than have to go through the rigmarole of then opening the packet and so on and so forth. The problem with that is that once you've opened these things, you can use them again in extremis. Of course, you would do so. But once they are unclean and exposed to the environment, you should really chuck them away and get a new one. And so even though they're very, very cheap, forcing contact with the enemy can go through these in their thousands very, very quickly, depending on the scale of combat. So tourniquets are a very, very simple means of saving life and limb, but does take some quite tricky handling, and you need to know what you're doing, and you go through them at a right old rate of knots. So yeah, just all to be and I think that's why we see so many of these sort of self-starting volunteer charity organisations who are raising money for tourniquets. It's there are so many of them, and they do need to be designed correctly to do the job efficiently, and they get used up. But yes, it's a very important part, and they do absolutely save lives. Anyway, sorry, Joe, back to you.
No, so well, just to stress their importance. Whenever you see soldiers on the front line or near the front line, they will always have a tourniquet strapped to their plate carrier, as well as combat shears. It's the go-to, the initial bit of kit that can be really life-saving. But what we have learned as well throughout this time, and because there is such a need for this style of kit and type of kit, is actually some of the kit being used by Ukraine's medics is considered very substandard. It's cheap tourniquets that have been purchased from China. There are some suggestions that lots of shipments of sort of aid when it comes to first aid supplies has been sent from Western countries, Western governments, Western organizations, being out of date. So it's just a massive sort of rethink of what Ukraine needs to bring itself up to the standard when it comes to sort of military medicine to get to that point. And so the person who's been charged with that is a chap called Major General Anatoly Kazmashuk, and he was the head of Kyiv's main military hospital before he was promoted to lead its medical military forces. But this hasn't gone down entirely fantastically, maybe. So Rina Rezhnik, who is a combat medic with Ukraine's Azov Brigade, we can probably call her a bit of a influencer. She's got a great Twitter following. She's very informative. But she said this was not a productive decision to appoint Major General Rezhnik. She went on to say on X, on Twitter, whatever we call it these days, I wanted a charismatic leader as the commander of the medical forces, but I hope the new commander will at least be careful in his decisions and actions and will rely on the military medical community. So she's saying basically we, the combat medics, need to be spoken to more proactively and for decisions to be made. Interestingly, this debate comes at a time when US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, he today, so Monday, made an unannounced visit to Kyiv. So Lloyd Austin, he met with Ukrainian leaders and reassured them of Washington's continued backing as they head into what is likely going to be a difficult winter for Ukraine against Russian forces. So Lloyd Austin, he took the traditional journey by train from Poland for what is only his second trip to the Ukrainian capital. And arguably, we're in a much more difficult place than when we last saw Lloyd Austin in Kyiv. He last visited in April 2022, when Ukraine had quickly battled through the initial invasion stage and were starting to look like a force that was going to hold on and start pushing back their Russian occupiers. So this is what Lloyd Austin had to say on X, as we said, formerly known as Twitter. I'm here to deliver an important message. The United States will continue to stand with Ukraine in their fight for freedom against Russia's aggression, both now and into the future. Why is this important? There's lots of talk. As we always say, anyone that appears on this podcast and podcast will know there is a massive debate about what happens with Ukraine's aid from the US. So Congress have looked to hold up and block packages. And this is at a time when Washington is still Ukraine's largest military backer, having provided more than $74 billion in military assistance. That also includes humanitarian aid and financial support. So it's slightly been eclipsed by the European Union in terms of the sort of the macroeconomic package. But as it stands, Washington is the biggest backer militarily. So it's a real sort of scary prospect that for Ukraine, that if it loses the US, there could be fears that it's all over, basically. But so yeah, President Joe Biden, he is pledged to back Ukraine in its fight against Russia for as long as it takes. But as I said, he also faces problems in Congress where Republican lawmakers continue to thwart that aid for Ukraine or want to place conditions on that assistance. And it comes at a time when the US is about to move into an election cycle. So politics is important. You only have to look at sort of what happens in Europe when Robert Fico, he comes in as Slovakia's prime minister, and suddenly you've got one of Ukraine's most ardent backers in Eastern Europe is now a country that is not willing to send weapons but instead sell weapons to Ukraine. That's another one. And then I will turn to an interesting story that I wrote up over the weekend about how European Union countries are quietly funding Vladimir Putin's war machine. So we found out EU countries have sent funds to the tune of 6.1 billion euros, that's 5.4 billion pounds this year, through their purchase of liquefied natural gas. So these purchases come despite a promise from the EU to wean itself off of Russian fossil fuels. The number of cargo ships carrying LNG from Russia to Europe has increased. The bloc has bought up more than half of Moscow's LNG exports, with Spain and France being the second and third largest buyers behind China. So Eurostat trade data, that's the EU's basically trade statistics office, acquired by Telegraph by me, shows Madrid sent 1.8 billion euros to Moscow in the first 9 months of this year, purchasing LNG. The second largest purchaser it moved to become France, with shipments worth 1.5 billion. And they were closely followed by Belgium, who had bought LNG from Russian firms and Russia for 1.36 billion euros in the first sort of 9 months of this year. So, and that also doesn't exclude some of Kyiv's most ardent backers, even though the numbers are a lot smaller. But Estonia and Lithuania, the two Baltic states, who have done as much as physically possible to aid Ukraine, give them weapons, funds, back really hard, harsh sanctions on a European Union level, have also continued to buy Russian LNG to a certain extent. And the sale of this is generating sort of huge revenues for Putin. It helps him pour money into his military at a time when, but essentially when Russia is most in need of funds. What's interesting, it's Europe has promised to wean itself off of Russian fossil fuels by 2027, and it wanted to basically cut that number by 2/3 by the end of this year. But while Europe has sanctions on Russian oil exports and Russian coal exports, it has made no effort in seeking to cut off Russian gas supplies in any form. Basically, as analysts would say, given how tight it is for the global gas supply and how quickly European gas and power prices can rise if its supply is lost. And I believe Dom has a question, so I'll stop there and I'll answer that.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And I'm sorry to ambush you with this one. It might not even be your area. Maybe we should get Sue back from the economics desk. But you talk about liquefied natural gas there and Europe's effort to wean itself off Russian gas. There are huge efforts at the moment to build the infrastructure around Portugal, Spain, elsewhere, some of the Dutch ports, I think, to take American LNG. And equally, the US have been huge investors in LNG down their eastern seaboard. There's all these ports there. So it's going to take time, but Europe is essentially trying to wean itself off Russian gas and put us on US gas, because they're fracking and what have you. They've got just tons of this stuff lying about. I don't know if gas lies about. I'm sorry, I'm 20 physicists in the room, geologists, and anyway. But the point is that this huge infrastructure bill by the US is starting to have an effect with the ports to receive the LNG in Europe. And I just wonder if you had a feel, Joe, for how far down that route we were and how close to the sort of 2027 target we are with Europe building its own LNG ports to shift the focus from Russia onto domestic supply, of course, but mainly US LNG. I wonder if you had a view there.
Yeah, I do. And so the countries that I mentioned, and you mentioned, so Spain is a massive, massive market and often acts as a hub for LNG. So that is one of the reasons. And the other reason is that Spain and Belgium have essentially claimed that the high purchases of Russian LNG traveling through their ports is basically down to traders storing Russian LNG at facilities at their ports. So it might not be domestically being used, but they are massive shipping terminals regardless of that. So what was quite interesting, one of the things that I found when I was researching this was the Belgian ports of Antwerp and Zeebrugge, as Brussels correspondent for the Telegraph, as two ports I'm very familiar with, often have travelled down to Antwerp to look at various drugs busts and the shipments of cocaine into Europe. But actually LNG is a massive massive issue here. And so Zeebrugge and Antwerp essentially act as hubs for 18 markets around the world. And that includes for supplying France and Germany. But only 2.8% of that gas is consumed domestically. And that's according to government data. So I think it's fascinating to see. But I was speaking to some analysts over the weekend, and they actually said Europe has taken more Russian LNG this year, partly because Russia's own production has dramatically increased itself, and because Asia has continued to not actively outbid Europe for that supply. So essentially, while there are no sanctions on Russian gas, business continues as usual. So look, as I said, look, there's not an effort. Their country's calling for it, but indeed it just hasn't happened. Russia weaponized gas exports to Europe earlier in this crisis, sort of ahead of last winter, by cutting off pipeline gas supplies into Europe. And then we've had like Nord Stream 2 and stuff like that. But they've continued to export Russian LNG. And basically, you speak to sort of national governments in Europe and they go, well, we still have to keep the lights turned on. We're trying as hard as we can to diversify, but we can't do it in this. So this is from an analyst I was speaking to, and I took notes down from the reason Europe can target other commodities, so coal and oil, but not gas, is that Russia can mostly reroute them to non-European markets without reducing global supply. In contrast, Russian pipeline gas cannot be rerouted without building new pipelines over several years, and the LNG supply from the Yamal Peninsula in Siberia mostly has to go to Europe because over November to May periods, the North Sea route to Asia gets blocked by heavy ice. So it's essentially geography, the weather, why the supplies are continued. And until basically, while I'm sure, and there is evidence to say that like European governments are trying to find ways of importing more LNG from elsewhere, the contracts are still being drawn up. So what's interesting, Britain, we have big LNG terminals in Northern Ireland. We have actually placed a ban on imports of Russian LNG, and we look elsewhere for our liquefied natural gas, but European countries aren't quite there yet. So it's more of sort of hard sort of questions it has to ask itself. So earlier this year, Kadri Simpson, who's the EU's energy commissioner, she called on the EU to basically reduce its reliance on Russian LNG. The US is trying to curb Russia's plan to become a major LNG exporter. So I think Moscow is basically planning to produce about 100 million tons of the fuel by 2030, which is a huge amount. And without anything done about it at sort of a European level, I can imagine that is going to continue flowing to Europe. So Teresa Ribera, who is a Spanish energy minister, earlier this year, she sort of basically blamed the fact of there being scarcities around when it comes to gas supplies. And that is why Europe is continuing to buy Russian LNG. But on the flip side, it is basically sending billions and billions of euros, which can be used by Russia to, say, fund weapons, various other things, keep its economy afloat at a time when the West is trying its best to shut its economy down to stop the war in Ukraine. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I note Lloyd Austin's comments about the US administration sticking with Ukraine for as long as it takes. As long as it takes to do what, Joe? You know, we could really do with a bit of clarification here about, do you want Ukraine to win? Do you want Ukraine to not lose? You know, what does all that look like? So, yeah, as long as it takes, great. A nice phrase, but we could do with unpacking that just a little bit if possible. Joe, thank you. We'll come back to you at the end. I'm keen to hear your opinion about Argentina's new president, Javier Milei, he's making very positive noises about supporting Ukraine, but he also, reportedly, a guy who has 4 clones of his dead dog, is dating an actress known for playing the previous president and claims to be a tantric sex expert. So look forward to hearing all about that from you later, Joe. You've probably got a lot in common. Now, James Kilner, over to you. Delighted to have you back. Hybrid war on Finland's border with Russia, and Igor Girkin risks pulling a Prigozhin. What's going on there?
Hi, Dom. Yep, it was another busy weekend on the Russia desk. Let's start with the Finnish border. So this was a story that's been brewing for about a week. I remember the previous weekend, Finland banned people crossing the border from Russia on bicycles. Didn't give any reason. It wasn't very clear. And then a few days later, we found out this is because They say that the Kremlin, Russia, has been giving bicycles and foot scooters to migrants from Somalia, Yemen, Syria, other places in the Middle East, and pushing them, funneling them towards the border with Finland. The Finns have since closed 4 out of 8 road borders with Russia because they say this is the sort of migration push by the Kremlin is part of their hybrid warfare. Listeners to this podcast will obviously remember that last summer, Wagner Group, the mercenary group the Kremlin mercenary group that we've spoken so much of, was accused by the Italian intelligence services of putting people into boats in Libya and sending them over to Italy. And we know that Belarus has also sent migrants in 2021, 2022 to Poland and Lithuania. Western military analysts say that this is all part of the Kremlin hybrid warfare. As we know, the Kremlin is feeling very confident at the moment, having pretty much seen off the Ukrainian counteroffensive over the last 4 or 5 months and watching the events in the Middle East take the spotlight away from Ukraine. They've ramped up their sort of basic production of artillery cells, that sort of thing. They've signed deals with North Korea. Ukraine is, by the sound of it, struggling to match this increase in production. So Putin is feeling very confident, Kremlin is feeling very confident. They're typically looking, and Russia and the Soviet Union previously have done this throughout history, they're looking for weaknesses in the Western system. They're looking to test the West and pressure what they see are the more fragile areas. And migration they've identified as a key weakness in the Western democratic system. It's caused a lot of anxiety, as we all know. And they're now testing this out against Finland. The reason they've been giving bicycles and scooters, and there's loads of videos and photographs of these poor migrants being shuttled pushed towards the Finnish border with pushing bicycles and riding bikes, because people are not actually allowed to walk between the two checkpoints on the border areas. They've got to go by some sort of vehicle, and up until recently, bicycles did count as a vehicle. When the Finns banned bicycles, they switched to the Kremlin or the Russians switched to giving these migrants foot scooters. Now, normally, as we know, the main migration routes to Europe are across the Mediterranean and through Central Asia. I think Joe was in Hungary last week taking a close look at this sort of thing, and not through the northern areas, cold Arctic northern areas, which border Russia. So we're not talking about a huge amount of migrants. We're talking about 300 or 400 in the past week compared to near zero. Anyway, the Finns have accused the Kremlin of doing this deliberately. They say that this is retribution by the Kremlin for the Finland joining NATO earlier this year. Today, Finland's hosted for the first time as a NATO member state a major naval war game within NATO. As in response, Russia has denied this and said that all the migrants, all the people trying to get to Finland are there legally. They're there on student visas. They're there on work visas, and they're allowed to travel to Finland. So we've seen all this before. It's closing borders up on the Finland-Russia area, and it's more of the hybrid warfare playbook that the Kremlin has used increasingly. Dom.
Yeah, I mean, we saw it on the, as you say, the border in Belarus and Poland. Is there any suggestion there's anything coordinated? Is there any rumblings there at the moment? Are you anticipating a sort of another front to be opened in the migratory war there?
No, I haven't seen anything over the last few weeks about this. There were reports rather in the summer when Wagner were in Belarus, shortly after their rebellion, when they were billeted in Belarus. There was chat about Wagner mercenaries dressing up as migrants and trying to push people across the border there again. I understand it is still a problem, but as we know, the Poles and the Lithuanians have erected massive fences and are keeping a very close eye on it. The Finns are also building huge fences. So, yeah, this issue is not going to go away, and clearly the Kremlin is very determined to pressure it. As we know, they have a lot of leverage in Libya, and this is a key migration route to Italy and in the EU. So I definitely expect that to continue.
Yes, I think you're probably on the money there. Now, bizarre story. I mean, bizarre because I just amazed that he's come out so boldly. But what can you tell us about Igor Girkin and his comments over the weekend?
So Igor Girkin, known more commonly in Russia as Strelkov, that's his nom de guerre, means shooter or arrow man. Shooter is probably the best translation in English. He is this ex-FSB colonel who was quite a high-profile figure in the initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014 in the Donetsk region, where he was acting with sort of Kremlin support, but also as a freelancer, and he became a de facto minister of this rebel region for a while before the Kremlin decided he had to be gotten rid of. As people remember, he's a wanted war criminal by The Hague. He's involved in the shooting down of MH17, the Malaysian airline, which killed nearly 300 people in the summer of 2014, etc., etc. And he was really out in the wilderness since 2014 until the Kremlin's invasion of full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 22, when he reinvented himself as an arch nationalist populist blogger and a YouTube analyst sort of thing. And he had really become this high-profile thorn in the side of the Kremlin, the figurehead for these ultra-Zedders, these ultra-nationalists who wanted the Kremlin to go harder and faster, even than Putin could stomach. And they've been very critical from the start about the way the Kremlin has persecuted its war. They wanted a full mobilization in Russia, and they wanted a full-on attack on Kiev again and again and again. This year, we've seen sort of a fragmentation of these ultra-nationalist Zedders and the Kremlin and the Ministry of Defense. And over the summer in July, Strelkov or Girkin was actually arrested and shoved in prison, charged with extremism. And it's from this pre-trial prison that he's managed to release a statement through his allies who are still at large, still operating. And he said that he wants to run in this presidential election, which is slated for Russia on March 17th next year. Now, this spices up straight away what was looking rather like a dead rubber. Putin has not yet officially declared his candidature, although we know that the Kremlin is preparing the path. He's probably going to stand as an independent, and he wants to sort of make this war his crown and glory. And he's going for another 6 years, which should then become another 12 years in power. And he should romp to victory, helped by the Kremlin's use of electronic voting and utter domination of the political machines, etc., etc. Now, and there will be a couple of Potemkin fake opposition candidates who were there to gild the lily and make it look like a real deal. But it's these fringe candidates, these genuine opposition candidates that viewers or listeners rather, need to watch out for. They're the ones which could really destabilize Russia and really shine a light on not a light, but act as a sort of a lightning rod for dissent. And there is dissent in the system. Be it the ultra-nationalists on the hard right or sort of more moderates who are getting tired of the war and the way it's been carried out, which I think we'll get onto a little bit later. But so Girkin, he very much represents the top, the most high profile of these ultra-nationalists. They're often on the Telegram social messaging side. They run the bloggers. They are influential. So he's announced his candidature. Now, to be a candidate in the Russian presidential election, you have to be nominated either by a political party, an official political party, or you need 300,000 signatures. There is no political party which is going to nominate Girkin as their candidate, and he's not going to get 300,000 signatures. In any case, it needs to be passed off by the Central Election Committee, which is controlled by the Kremlin and can easily disqualify him, etc., etc. But Girkin knows this, and he said in his statement that he is highly unlikely to be allowed to run. He already knows this. But he did say, and I quote, that he expects to act as a rallying point for real patriots. And he said, in any case, this guarantees a disruption of their quiet and comfortable swampland on their planet of pink ponies. So a great, great quote and a clear mission statement that he understands he's not going to be allowed to stand for real, but he is acting as that sort of dissenter in generating media headlines and, frankly, annoying the Kremlin.
Blimey, a planet of pink ponies. I didn't see that one coming. But how long do you give him? I mean, he's in prison. I just think it's extraordinary that he's speaking like this. He's saying that the election is going to be a sham. He's saying that it's all rigged and that people know who's going to win already. So, I mean, is this some sort of massive conversion? Has he now turned to the light side, and he's trying to call out Russia with what little time he has left? He's got a fear for his safety, hasn't he? After Prigozhin,
I think he'd already set himself up very much as an opposition to the Kremlin, and his sort of antipathy or unease and increasing oppositionness to the Kremlin really started in 2014 when he was down in Donetsk, initially with the Kremlin's backing, and then they sort of sacked him when he overstepped the mark, and then he was 9 years or 8 years in the wilderness, etc. And like I said, he really has represented this hardcore ultra-nationalist side who are looking for this greater Russia project, who wanted the Kremlin to go in harder and faster. And he has always said in the entire war that the Kremlin has got this wrong. The Kremlin is going to do this poorly. They're cocking it up because they didn't go in and they didn't push for Kiev, properly. They didn't mobilize the Russian people properly, etc., etc. So I think he's already finished as a sort of figurehead who he survived longer than most people thought he would out in the open. And his arrest in July really didn't come as much surprise to Russia watchers, because he had been getting increasingly angry and loud about all this. So I think this is a sort of last grab for headlines, probably before his trial and his imprisonment.
Fair enough. Answers on a postcard, please, folks. I think I'd sell January the 6th at the moment, but we shall see. Okay, let's go on to final thoughts now. I'll start, and then Joe and James. I wanted to bring this to your attention. A Ukrainian teenager who was kidnapped by Russia from Mariupol has returned home yesterday. So Bogdan Yelmykin, who was 18 actually yesterday on his birthday, he had been placed with a foster family near Moscow and had been told to report to a Russian army draft office next month. But he appealed to President Zelensky to get him back. He'd previously attempted to get out of the country in March. There was some, diplomacy, I guess, behind the scenes, and he got out yesterday. So he's back in Ukraine. He was reported by Reuters as saying, "The emotions are overwhelming, all good with the notion that Ukraine needs me." That's great. Great to have him back. Now, Ukraine says 20,000 children have been illegally transferred to Russia since the start of the full-scale invasion. And I would recommend, if you missed it on Friday, please do listen back to last Friday's episode when we spoke to a children's campaigner, Mykola Kaleba, who had just been the night before, won the Magnitsky Award for Outstanding Human Rights Activist, and through whose efforts over 200 children kidnapped by Russia have returned. Now, he's the first to say that much more needs to be done. 200 is not many, but it's a start, and we're happy to highlight his work. So please do have a listen back to Friday. But welcome home, Bogdan. Now then, final thoughts. Joe first, please.
Thanks, Dom. Yeah, let's go to Javier, I think, Malaya, as we've come to pronounce him, the sort of the right-wing former tantric sex coach, once chainsaw-wielding campaigner, who has just won the elections to become Argentina's president-elect. So this is quite interesting. Argentina was once a country that Russia could count on to sort of support it, be partners and allies with it. But despite this new chap who has come to power, he has a pro-Ukrainian outlook on life and on democracy and just, which is entirely different from what Argentina and a lot of countries in what we call the global south, so South America, the sort of the Arab states, Saudi Arabia, etc. All these countries that are traditionally sort of allies of Russia. This could be a breakaway moment. So he was asked at one point before the Argentinian Legislative Assembly, and Javier Malaya said, "I bought the Ukrainian flag because those of us who support the ideas of freedom cannot tolerate or support an invasion like Russia has done to Ukraine." And then when challenged about the Argentinian government's stance at the time, so his predecessors, he criticised it as stating that the previous Argentinian position is weak and that it was complicit in supporting the worst kind of dictatorships. So that obviously sparked a little bit of concern in Moscow. So the Kremlin said today They had taken note of the statements about Russia from Argentina's president-elect Javier Milei, but wanted to maintain strong ties with Buenos Aires. So, as I said, Milei has supported sort of relationships backing for Ukraine, and he also wants to see the United States and Israel as Argentina's main players, rather than moving away to the likes of Russia, Brazil, where he has ties to Bolsonaro, leader that once leader that. So Dmitry Peskov, who we know as the Kremlin spokesman today, he said, "We noted a number of statements that Mr. Milei made during his election campaign, but we will focus on and judge him mainly by the statements that he makes after the inauguration. We support the development of bilateral relations with Argentina." So to give you a context of the Argentina's outgoing left-wing or centre-left government, depends on how you describe them, had sought to maintain close ties with Russia. It was an importer of Russia's Sputnik V COVID vaccine. It was a member of the Moscow-backed BRICS group of nations. Yeah, so I just think it's interesting. We don't, as I think Peskov has got it right, that until this guy comes in and actually starts making decisions, we don't know what they're going to do. Are they going to suddenly start sending weapons to Ukraine, which I don't know the Argentinian military that greatly, but I'm sure weapons would be favoured. But that's just me speculating. But what it does mean is the likes of Russia, Brazil, China, these kind of global outliers who don't believe in what we believe in the UK and in the United States and in Ukraine these days, then Argentina and Buenos Aires are now looking forward to a sort of better relationship in that sphere of the world. Few more things to add about him for our UK listeners. He's obviously continued in great Argentinian tradition to claim sovereignty over the Falkland Islands. And while I don't think he would invade the Falkland Islands, he is going to, of course, continue that great tradition of Argentinian, claim to it, loud rhetoric and shouting matches over it. Yeah, whether he's going to make an interesting sort of difference to Argentina, I don't know. He's a bit bonkers. He's sort of backed coming out in favour of the human organ trade and said it's just another market. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see how it actually translates into Argentina's support for Ukraine and if that actually sort of manifests into anything. It's obviously all very different now, but it's just nice to be hearing some rhetoric from that part of the world that supports Ukraine rather than being sort of a bit quiet and maybe even on the Russian side of the argument there. And I'll stop there. Thanks for listening, folks.
Yeah, he's also said he wants to get rid of the peso and replace it with the US dollar. So I wonder if his comments about Ukraine are more seen through the lens of him trying to court the US administration, and therefore that might change on a dime. No pun intended. If the administration changes. Anyway, news or comment for another day, I'm sure. James, final thought, please.
Well, really, just to add a few details to what you were talking about earlier, Dom, with these. They're not protests in Russia. They're sort of it's this grassroots sort of organisation or loose organisation of people who want to see their mobilised men back from the front line. These it's called Pute Domoi, which means the way home or homeward bound, and they are not protesting against the war. They're just saying, and these are really mothers and wives and girlfriends of men who were mobilised in September 22. If you remember, the Kremlin mobilised about 320,000 men back then, and they haven't even allowed them back for a break, even if they're wounded. And really, this is what the MOD was talking about in their message this morning, and what Don was relating earlier in the programme. And this flashed up in my news feed yesterday, where there was supposed to be a Pute Domoi protest or rally in central Novosibirsk, a large university town in Siberia. But it got banned, obviously. The authorities obviously banned this sort of thing. But the authorities are concerned and nervous about wives and mothers of soldiers getting political. And they did relent. The authority, the heads of the town, of the city, did relent to having a meeting with about 30 of these wives and mothers. Journalists were banned, but this is really important to keep an eye on, and really important to see how the authorities react, because obviously they're going to ban them, but the fact they're even talking to them is significant. And if this grassroots organisation can keep going and can gain some traction then we may see shifts in the way the Kremlin prosecutes its war in Ukraine, how it sends men to the front line, and that may in turn trigger weaknesses in their system. It's definitely something to watch out for if you're interested in Russia and Ukraine and the way the war is going.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We're also doing the same for what is unfolding in the Middle East. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. As the disinformation war ramps up, we are relying on your support more than ever. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk, and we do read every message. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Giles Gear. Executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.